everyone on this new episode of Let's Talk AI. I'm super happy to be here with Thales. Thales, how are you doing?
Yes, I'm fine. And you, Thomas? I'm very excited to be
Very,
here.
very good, very good. Thank you. I'm super happy to be here. Just a quick reminder to everyone who is listening. Let's Talk AI is the 360-degree vision of the data and AI field with experts. Today with Thales. Maybe Thales, for the people who might not know you, I've been following you for some time on LinkedIn, and Paul recommended me to contact you. Check out the episode with Paul. It is a very interesting machine learning operations, frameworks, ML engineer episodes, and I think it have been. Um, um, I mean, a lot of people have gave very good feedback. So this is why we're here today, and maybe you can present yourself in a few words.
Yes. So, hi, everyone. My name is Thales. As Thomas said, I'm also an ML engineer. I'm friends with Paul via LinkedIn. And yeah, so I started my career studying mathematics. I'm also an engineer. I started as an electrical engineer and then I went to mathematical engineering. So, and then I started working as an ML engineer. So I've been an ML engineer for about 4 years now.
Wow, that's super. Okay, I can already have I already have many questions about different parts, but I always try to ask first, what are you trying to achieve today in your career? Um, what is your focus right now?
Yeah, so currently I have two main focuses, I would say. The first is being building a solid career in AI, having the knowledge to back up my decisions, being the most data driven as possible, I would say, and understanding how data can contribute to better companies and a better society in general. And the second goal that comes up a little bit with that, I would say, is to help out others who are starting same level, who maybe are facing similar issues that I've already faced, and maybe I can give them a little tip. And that's what I've been trying to do on LinkedIn. I mean, it's an amazing community. I've already learned so much from Paul, from many others, and I think I also try to contribute to that community as well.
And you do more than trying. I've been following some of your contents, and it is very high quality. So maybe for the people who are listening, to just to get to know you a little bit better, you mentioned a bit your education path, a bit what you've been doing, but can you give a brief retrospective of like the studies you've done and what you've been doing in your career?
Yes. So I've worked in many because in machine learning, both at the part of research. So I've already published some articles in NLP, and also the production part. So putting models into production, managing models in production, which is always a treat. And also, looking to that whole optimization part, which I would say is the core of the ML engineering profession and MLOps professional as well. But they optimize different parts, I would say, of the pipeline. So MLOps being optimizing the infrastructure, trying to get the model as a black box to run as smoothly as possible and everything. And ML engineering focusing more on the model itself sometimes.
Mm.
But
Mm-hmm.
also, as this is an emerging field, I would say those roles are not actually very separated. They depend a lot on the company we are currently into. So right now, for example, I'm doing everything from research to production. So
So, could you maybe explain what is a machine learning engineer with your own words and with your experience?
yes, for sure. So to me, I would say the machine learning is bringing models to production. So usually, data scientist is someone who's going to take a problem.
Right. Mm-hmm. Right. Right. I think I'd like to um, go more in depth in this question and ask if you were to give some advice. Well, maybe this is a good opportunity also to explain what you share on LinkedIn based on this kind of experience and the content you're sharing. But my question would go as follow: could you share maybe for any data professionals, whether they're data scientists or data engineers, how do you see a machine learning engineer path to start with? Like, where would you start if you were a beginner? And where would you improve if you are a more advanced professional who have some experience with machine learning engineer?
Okay. Yeah. So for beginners, I would say the first step is trying to put at least one model in production. So either through an API, a batch request, even computation of some things, because sometimes it's useful to reduce latency to pre-compute most of the stuff.
Mm-hmm.
So I would say the first thing you need to do, if you're already a programmer and you're looking into that, is try to even take, I would say, a model that's already been trained. For example, in Hugging Face and in other platforms, there are quite many of those. Try to put that into production. So try to work with the cloud. I usually suggest AWS to start because it's the largest one right now. So I think it's a good start, and I will try to put the model into production, which is what I try to guide you through my book MLOps 101, which is basically the end project. The goal is to have an inference pipeline in production that's running smoothly in the cloud.
Hmm. Awesome. And for the
Yeah.
people who are maybe more advanced, how would you go about refining your skills and being better a better machine learning? What does that even mean?
So for more advanced people, my recommendation would be to get a very hands-on approach. It's something I really like,
Right.
especially in engineering. I think the best way to learn things is to build things. So usually try to build different products, different types of products with machine learning. So if, for example, you're doing batch inference at work, maybe try something real time, maybe take a look into retraining, you know, monitoring your model in production, tools like that. I would pick a one or two tools at max for each of those concepts and try to build a roadmap for myself. And of course, I will try at the most sharing into LinkedIn because I think it's very
Mm-hmm.
useful to get feedback from the community, learn your blind spots as well. Things you haven't took a look at and
Mm-hmm.
could be important on the library, for example, or even people who have already used that library in production and saw some other constraints that you weren't aware, which is usually the case.
Mm-hmm.
So it's that would be the approach I would take and that I'm taking.
So now we have a better understanding of the machine learning engineer. We'll get into the pitfalls, into the challenges that you can face on your on a daily basis. Maybe for the people who are listening, I think it could be very interesting if you share your experience and what you've been doing in the field so
Okay.
far in your
Yeah.
career.
So I've worked with many different domains of machine learning, both in research and production. And so, for instance, recommender systems, in general. Now I'm working with psychologists to produce the personality-based models combined with AI to get, personality-based hiring. that privileges soft skills. So I've also worked in a startup for audio recognition. So there are many different types of applications of machine learning systems I've already worked with, and I would say that gives me a pretty broad view of the field in general.
That sounds super interesting. Um, yeah, psychology um, recommendation system is very interesting. Um, so I'll definitely ask you some things about that. Through your career, what are the main challenges that you faced as a
Right.
machine learning engineer?
So the main challenges I would say are usually engineering related, you know, because the model was working fine. Usually you get good metrics, but the challenge is how to get the data into the model in production, how to get the model to make predictions at a reasonable latency, how to pay as little as possible for that, because that's a huge issue usually for business, I would say, and for us by consequence. So you need to keep an eye on cost as well. So how much infrastructure would you need to deploy your solution? Can you maybe compromise on metrics in order to get a simpler solution that works better than the current state, but already has some improvements, and that is remains cost efficient. So those are the main challenges that a
Mm,
machine learning faces every day.
right. Um, you mentioned cost management, and you mentioned business. And at the beginning, also you mentioned that your goal is to be data driven and to serve the business with your ML engineer skills. How important it is, and this is kind of an obvious question. The easy answer would be obviously it is very important, but um, I'm really eager to know your state on this perspective and how you implement it on a daily basis. So my question is, how do you make sure that you don't get lost in the detail of what we're trying to achieve or the best metrics or the best optimization? Because as engineers we can sometimes get very into the specific parts, but how do we make sure that we stay aligned with specific metrics that are business focused and that we deliver real value which have in the end an impact in reducing cost or increasing the returns that the
Okay.
company can make?
Yeah, I would say that talking to business people is really important, at the beginning of the project, in the middle of the project, throughout the project, at the end of the project, constantly talking to them, really grasping where the pain is, because sometimes the specs, if the spec is not done by you, you do not really understand where the pain actually is, and maybe your model does not address
Hmm.
that correctly. So I would say do a good business spec, take time to really specify the requirements for your project, think about the use cases, because once you have everything, like I really like the quote from Einstein. So if you had a hundred, I don't remember exactly, but 99% of the time you should be thinking about the problem and 0.5 about the solution. It's something like that, which I think really
Hmm.
represents something really good, because if you really understand the problem, then coming up with a solution, I would say, is the easy part. The difficult part is understanding what you're trying to achieve. So I usually spend a lot of time on this. And also, I think when
Right.
communicating with them, it's really important to address them in terms they understand, because for us, talking about embeddings and metrics and F1 scores, it's really day to day, but not for them, so you should try to address them in a manner they would understand, and they would try to be on board of your solution, basically, because you have to kind of sell your solution to business people. Otherwise, your model will never see the light of day.
Right. And this is so important. I discussed with Ala. We have an episode, also a recent episode that you can find on Listock AI on the YouTube channels or any streaming platforms. And it's fascinating how we can get lost with vocabulary and not speaking the same languages, even though we want the same thing. For example, Ala was working with a fire station um, with um, with her class at her university, and and basically they had to understand all the jargon, all the words that the fire station department uses and their processes before being able to do anything. And she also mentioned that they did an entire use case of data science just to find out that the systems, the data that were being collected wasn't fine, like it wasn't correct. So the model was working incredibly well, but it didn't make any sense because the data was all wrong. So the system had a huge important part also in this. And so this is a little example maybe to enhance a little bit what
Yeah,
you've been
for sure.
saying. Do you have maybe um, an example for us about some one time or specific projects, or like to showcase a little bit the framework that you have when you try to add value to the business, thinking of the solution, because so you mentioned this quote of Einstein, and we can a lot of the time think about the solutions and think about better way, more complex way to do better things. But like you said, if we capture the full solution that we're trying to solve, this is most of the time it doesn't require that much complex things. So maybe you can share some of the frameworks you go by um, on approaching a specific problem and how you will do this switch between speaking with the business and making
Yeah,
sure
for sure.
everything's aligned.
So the first thing I usually do when I have a project like that is to, start writing a Notion. I really like Notion, so I will get a Notion document that's styled like a project spec. They have a pretty good templates, so if you want to take it, to check it out. But I would usually also mark all the stakeholders in the project on the page, because then they can see it, they can add projects, and I try to record every advancement I make in there so that they have access all the time to it. They can ask questions, they can comment and everything. And what I usually do is that I write the problem at first, so I give some context to the project and I try to describe the problem as precisely as possible. And then I
Mm-hmm.
come up with a draft solution. So the first thing I would do is try to understand the current system, if there is one, to get a baseline, because if there's no improvement, it's
Right.
not worth it. So once I
Mm-hmm.
built and I understood how the baseline is working and I get the metrics for the baseline, then I would start drafting possible solutions, but I would not implement anything, just write possible ways to solve that. And then once I reread them with a fresh mind and trying to understand the problems, the potential problems, then I would go to the implementation, run one or two of them, the ones I judge the most prominent to solve the problem. And if I find a good solution, of course I record everything in terms of metrics. I keep the Notion up to date all the time. And then in the
Mm-hmm.
end, I would do a presentation. I always try to use Streamlit to build a little app where my users can interact with my model. I usually would do that because I think it's easier to visualize what we're expecting and what this could be like in a real scenario, because when you showcase, for example, slides or, draws, it's really nice for technical people, but sometimes business people, like, this will not add much value to them. So what I usually do is that I try to build a
Mm-hmm.
little app so that it also becomes a fun process to present the model. And then they would take a look.
Mm-hmm.
I would deploy this app. For example, you can do this quite easily in AWS with lambdas and everything. You can deploy your app really quickly with Docker, and
Mm-hmm.
then your users have an app that they can interact with to understand the pitfalls, try different scenarios, experiment. And once we have validated
Hmm.
all that, then we go into the production phase.
That's awesome. I feel like this is very valuable. And when it's in production phase, how do you iterate with business? How do you go about improving it, maintaining it, and making sure it's what they need and the value that is into their hands now is what
Yeah.
they
So the
expected
first thing
from
you
you.
need to do is to make sure that you collect feedback. So either from the user directly or through some metric that you're collecting behind the user's usage. So this is really
Hmm.
important because, as you said, if you don't have the data, you don't have anything to monitor. And once you have that, it's really important, to set up monitoring systems. Of course, if you have one or two models in production, I would say you can do this by hand because I know every company is not at the stage to have a really good MLOps infrastructure so that they can, you have everything connected. So that's really not the
Hmm.
case for every company. But if you don't have that, you can for sure do it by hand, but I would really recommend that you start trying to think already in ways for you to retrigger training automatically and everything like that, stuff like that. I think it's really important to
Right.
build up that infrastructure as you go along, so that your projects can really support themselves.
Yeah, and it reduces frictions and costs of potential next use cases that can also be very valuable. How do you go about communicating with the business or the people who are using these projects? Let's say you use the users. How do you communicate in non-technical terms, and how do you make sure they understood what you are trying to communicate,
Yeah.
and
I
vice
think
versa?
it's really interesting to deep dive into their day to day. So, for example, right now I work
Mm-hmm.
with a lot of psychologists. So I really try to read some papers about psychology, understand the terms on which they speak to one another, understand how they
Mm-hmm.
understand things. Really get into their shoes and try to learn as much as possible. Once that is a continual process, of course, but once you have a base, you can talk to them in terms they would understand. So, for example, some metric, I don't know, a precision. You could explain what precision actually means. Giving some examples, what would happen in that scenario or in this scenario. I find that giving clear examples is always useful, and to understand what
Mm-hmm.
they're talking about, I usually try to repeat what they said to me. So, like, so what you said was that, and if they say no, that's not at all what I'm saying, there's a problem, and I should try to grasp what they're
Yeah.
actually meaning. I think repeating them, it's really a good process to try to explain what they say to you directly. It's a really good process to make
Mm.
sure that you understood what they are looking for.
Right, right. Too big advice here, and I think very valuable ones. I really like how you take their knowledge, their feed, their expertise, and create specific examples of based on their knowledge to explain what you're trying to tell them. This is very interesting. I had many ideas, and hey, it is very interesting to do it that way because I would assume a lot of the times we can just take for granted that someone will kind of have an idea of what precision is, but then you have the confusion matrix, and then you're like trying to explain which metric is optimum to which metric is the best to optimize in that case. But then you need to explain why you're doing this work and why it's important. So I totally understand how you can do these fun analogies to a specific field to explain your point. And the second one, of course, paraphrasing is a very high communication skill, and
Yeah.
That's
Also for
super
beginners, I
interesting.
would say just a little
Um,
tip: never undermine the expert. They're experts on their field for a reason. They have knowledge to contribute to your work. So it's really, really important. For example, I was working with an NLP project, trying to identify psychology traits from phrases, for example, reproducing some NLP work.
mhm,
And my boss, for example, he's a psychologist, and he was like, okay, so that
mhm,
makes sense because of this and this. Some research here have shown already that those traits go together, for example. So integrating that knowledge
right.
is something really beautiful, and you can come up with beautiful things.
Yeah, I agree. This is awesome because first you get to know very well the industry. You get to like you're in your profession doing what you want to increase in, but you're also gaining a lot of expertise in something totally new, which is not necessarily technically related. And secondly, this is amazing how by understanding fully experts, we can create amazing products, and this will in the end be the quality of what we put in production, and how well we're able to interpret and reproduce with machines, I think is highly correlated with the quality of the products we're going to put
Yeah,
out there.
for sure.
So
Mhm.
I have many questions, to be honest. I would like to
Okay.
ask you about NLP. I would like to ask you about a specific use case of NLP, but just before, I would love to know about. So, you mentioned for anyone in the field who is getting at an advanced level, who have already put into production some models and have some quite good understanding of like cloud services and different tools to use. You mentioned writing and sharing with the community, and this is something you've been doing for some time. Um, so we talked a bit at the beginning, but I would love to come back on this. What do you share, and why do you share on LinkedIn if there are more topics? And mainly, I think my question is, what are like, how do you try to help others in the field?
Mhm.
So I have many questions, but feel free to answer however it feels
Okay,
the
so
best for
why
you.
do I write on LinkedIn? At first, it was really because I was seeing some nice posts, and I thought, hey, I could, try to do that too, because I saw that the community was really engaging, especially in machine learning. You see all the time the comments, some insights, some really interesting insights from other people. And I got really into that. So I started, writing, and I started really, engaging with a lot of interesting people. For example, James Andrew, he does a YouTube channel on Python. Paul, who talks a lot about machine learning, and we also exchange other ideas, even about creation, about how to best write and share your content with everyone. So there are many many examples. So today I consider myself lucky because I have a nice community that really, where I really learn a lot, and following some people really really helps as well. So that's the main reason I've been writing so far. And I really like to help both beginners and advanced level people, but I mostly focus on beginners because I think the big challenge is for them, especially right now, to get into the field. So what I try to do is usually bring a production first approach to them, because they're usually at school or they are usually beginning their career. So they've worked with notebooks, they know they work, they know how to build a logistic regression model in their notebook with an iris data set or whatever. But they're not mostly aware of the challenges something like that could have in production, for example. So what I try to do is usually recommend, give tips on how to manage industry problems, how to better put your models in production, how to put your models in production, because some of them never did it. And so I wrote a little ebook on that. It's called MLOps 101. It's a very hands-on approach where you can, at the end, put your model in production. But before, you're going to learn a lot about CI/CD, for example, which is something usually machine learning engineers are not aware until they go out of college, because it's something in the industry you cannot do anything without it. So there are many concepts which I will try to go through with them through the book to help them as well.
Right. And CI/CD, continuous deployment, continuous
Yes.
integration, if that's correct. Awesome. So if you're a beginner, if you're interested in this field, if you're interested in the ML engineer role, which is kind of, to my perspective, a mix between software engineer, data scientist, it might sound very overwhelming, but I mean, it can be. And at the beginning, more, because you need to have some fundamentals on different things, but it is worth it, very interesting. So if you have any interest, feel free to check out Thales on LinkedIn and on his socials, and check this ebook. And if you have any question also, and this is definitely not the end, we have many more topics to speak about, but this is just a little bit of conversation here. If you have questions, feel free to reach out on LinkedIn. If you have career questions, or questions regarding this episode, feel free to ask them, and we'll answer them. We'll be more than happy to answer them. So, getting back at the NLP career, would you have some NLP use case that you found particularly interesting, and the process you've went with this case could teach us some lessons? So, do you have any case use case in ideas that you've been doing in NLP that you could
Yeah,
share with us,
of
like
course.
step by step?
So recently, for example, I was doing a project which was about content validity in psychology tests. So, for example, I'll try to explain
Mm-hmm.
really fast. So, content validity is basically when a psychology builds a test. It usually contains items. There are usually affirmations. For example, I like to talk to other people. I like to be by myself. And those affirmations
Mm-hmm.
are designed to measure a specific trait. So for example, extroversion,
Right.
openness, agreeableness, the classic big five, and others. And
Mm-hmm.
the role of content validity is basically to understand if that is really measuring what is supposed to. Because if I say that item measures extroversion, but most of the people who took the test are understanding it as another thing, it doesn't make sense. So there was a recent
Mm.
paper who used the BERT. It's an NLP model which basically achieved a better performance at determining the items, so the classification, than humans.
Mm-hmm.
And what we did at SS First was that we applied that to the new questionnaire who just came out. That is Swipe. So it's a psychology questionnaire, and
Mm-hmm.
we've applied that, and we also put it in the psychometric manual. So it's basically a guide on how to use the test, what the test measures, and everything. And we were the first company to use NLP at for this application at a psychometric manual company wise. So
Hmm.
this was kind of a cool use case, which tells us a little bit about how to really understand the research, trying to understand how that research can be applied to your context, because that sometimes is
Hmm.
usually the challenge. You have a lot of really powerful models nowadays, I would say LLMs and all types of models, and you need to understand how to apply them to your specific context, because the context varies a lot depending on the size of your
Hmm.
company, the maturity level in terms of AI, and most
Mm-hmm.
other things, the cost they are willing to pay for AI, which is something really important,
Mm-hmm.
as we said before. So I would say that developing this perspective is really important.
Right. So, to make sure I understood correctly, you used You just did you say it was
Yes, it's
Berta?
the BERTA. It's disentangled representations. Yeah.
The Berta. All right. And so basically, you mentioned that you did the
Yes, I just
classification.
did a classification problem. Yeah.
All right, classification problem to like analyze to then use this classification and detect what can make sense applied to whatever you want to do with
Yes.
this
So the
information. Correct?
test is basically already, it was ready, but we were trying also to, understand better the items of the test, understand if they are measuring what they're supposed to. So what we did was, did we apply
Yeah.
this feedback loop between psychology and NLP to better understand that and to be able to release that in the psychometric manual. So you get, for example, I also extracted the embeddings and I put, I showed them where the the specific traits are being measured correctly. They were really different from one another. So I think that's the first test, first psychology test, which contains a content like that.
That's awesome. That's awesome. I would have many questions to go on there, and thanks for sharing this explanation. How important is it for you to? So, for example, you've done the classification. Maybe you're with data frames, and it sounds obvious to you, but to share your insights, to share your conclusions based on the application that you've been doing, how do you go about visualization or about explaining the conclusions and showcasing to people who are
Okay.
non-technical, which is kind of related to the previous, but because we have a specific use case, I think it can be interesting
Yeah.
to deep dive
So
into that.
what you usually need to do is first explain really well the metric you're trying to measure and why that metric makes sense for that use case. So, for instance, in this one, for example, I had to explain what was F1 score and why F1 score made sense in that case. And
Mm-hmm.
once you build that, you also need to present the baseline, basically show them the current level. So, for example, for us, it was the
Mm-hmm.
old test we had versus the new test. So
Mm-hmm.
I presented basically the metrics for the old test, the previous version of the test, and I presented the
Right.
metrics for the new improved version that they have launched recently. And then we were able to showcase with data and real concrete numbers that the model
Mm-hmm.
performed better, so that the items were actually better to measure what they're supposed to.
Mm. That's very interesting. That's very interesting. I'll not bother you with feature selections and
Mm.
training, like how do you train this classification. But that's super interesting, and the work that you're doing, I think also in the field we're very used to. And when I say the field, I talk about data and AI in general, which is very broad. But in machine learning engineer, there are many problems, and the fact that I would like to ask your opinion on how is it working with so the name of the
Yeah.
company is Assess First, right? How is how is it how does it feel to have a real impact? Uh, I mean, I think you maybe you can share a little bit about the company, and I would love to know about how you feel using those skills that are technical to come up with real decision that we have a real impact on
Yeah.
people's life.
So, starting with SS First. So, SS First is a company that tries to basically showcase the potential of each individual going beyond their CV, which is something very rigid, to really showcase basically based on their soft skills, their personality, trying to find the best contents for them to shine and show them what makes them unique, and basically presenting that also to companies. So I'm really glad to be working that because I use machine learning to help people basically better understand themselves, better understand their values, better understand the company's values, if they fit to one another, if that makes sense for them. Because some research show that usually culture and values are basically what would make people stay in the end. So basically, if you're aligned with the way your manager manages you, if you, for example, if you like that, if you like your team, if you're aligned with the way the team operates, so all of that is really important, and then basically it's what will define success in the end. And the beautiful thing
Mm.
is that there is no right or wrong traits. There's just a specific context where those traits can shine, and others where maybe you're not a good fit, but you're going to be much happier in another context. So I feel
Mm.
really happy to be working there.
That's awesome. And I like how you mentioned culture because in the previous episode and with Andreas, as I mentioned before, we've talked a lot about culture and how it can be really game changers in terms of career wise. Because if you have the right culture that suits you the best, you will be more productive, you'll have more energy, and you'll feel more not useful, but you will feel more accomplished, and that would lead to a better growth, I would assume. And so the fact that you're working on this specific problem, this is a great example for anyone out there who might think, all right, I'm data engineer, I'm a data scientist, I'm a machine learning engineer, I'm a business analyst, all those data jobs that we are saying those are numbers. Yes, you mentioned before optimization problems, and those are still optimization problems, and we can go about it in a data driven way and have a real impact into the world. So yes, we're doing data driven things, we're using data, but if you put people first and if you understand that the technology is what enhance um, better systems, happier people. This is a very
Mhm.
optimistic message, and I'm sure we'll have episodes on the show where we discuss that and we argue that. But uh, I wanted to share this vision, and this is something real. Do you want to
Yeah,
add
I
something
mean, I
regarding
totally
this?
agree with you. I mean, AI is here to help us. Basically, that's my philosophy. We should go in a direction where AI can be the most useful to us. So you need to really, I think, in my opinion, we need to really be careful, advancing, responsibly, understanding the impacts that will have on human lives, because human lives are, of course, the priority. Human quality of life is the priority, number one.
Hmm, exactly. And there are crazy data about if you look at the median or at the mean of the salaries in the US. I mean, you can discuss inflations and everything, but the quality of life, if you compare it to 1950s and to today's life, have increased considerably. Um, but
Mhm.
this is, I don't want to get into the surveys and the numbers and everything. This is for another moment. So speaking about culture, speaking about AI, we haven't talked much about LLMs. I've seen on LinkedIn recently, for anyone who is passionate about LLMs, that Azure have created a new service where you can deploy your chat GPT, but in an open source way, so that your data is isolated. And this is for enterprise. This is for enterprise. Of course, there are other open source models, let's say Llama 2, for example, where you can already do this, and in AWS, Azure. This is not at all sponsored by Azure, but I just saw this news on LinkedIn, which I thought can be fun and useful for some people. So back to my question. um, how do you see LLMs fitting in this big picture? Have you played a bit with them, and how do you see it evolving, and not only
Okay.
LLMs but AI in general?
Well, I would say that of course LLMs are the big thing right now. They do all things actually pretty well. So they are basically foundation models. Usually, they can perform in almost any task, which is quite nice. But to me, the future looks like mostly, them as enhancers, I would say. Because, for example, you will need to learn how to express yourself better so that they can understand you, and the interaction between human and machine is what is going to make the future brighter. I really am not a true believer in the fact that they're going to replace humans, but mostly in the fact that they're going to, transform the way that we do things, for example. So right now, we're seeing this a little bit with coding. So coding has been much about typing code for the last, I don't know, last years. But right now, we're coming to a point where you could express what you're thinking about engineering wise in a way that the LLM could produce the code. Of course, there are still many bugs. There are many privacy things. They say they produce sometimes unsafe code. So you need to still have an expert to interact with. And also, I think the most important thing is that the prompt needs to be really precise. So you need to know what you want. And usually, we don't know what we want if you're not an expert. So it's really hard to express what you want if you're not an expert. So that's where I think things are headed. For most jobs, you have an assistant, a personal assistant, probably, as you mentioned, with isolation, with something really important. So your own context, your own data, and then you would see more and more personal helpers, things like that, but usually as enhancers of the jobs. So, for example, for doctors, for engineers, for developers.
Exactly. And this will require a lot of time spent with experts, like you mentioned, like yourself, with psychologists, create the virtual psychologist that can address specific problems based on these guidelines. Very interesting. And so you've been some years. So this is LLM wise. You've shared about a bit about AI, but if we're speaking about AI in general, um, what, like, do you have any concerns? Do you have any doubts? How do you see these evolutions? You mentioned a bit, but asking again because maybe uh, I would love to hear a bit more about your vision on the state of the art of AI. And to put a bit of introduction before, I mean, things have grown so fast lately. I was reading. I was reading a book, and there is in 1950 again, 81% of the population in the US was doing work with their hands. And so the idea of doing work with our heads is very recent in the time frame. Um, if you look at the species of the human, it goes like for, I mean, 100, 200 years is nothing. So, putting into context the evolution of internet, the evolution of systems, the evolution of, well, today with the breakthrough of LLMs, but a lot of these are coming, and I personally believe it can be an exponential growth. That being said, yeah, how do you put AI, state of the art AI, and how do you see it? How threatening do you see it? Um, and how important is it to draw lines in the field?
Mhm.
A lot of questions here, but you can answer it freely
Okay.
on this subject.
I think for AI in general, the future is very promising. As you said, LLMs, we'll see more and more applications of this, which will be really, really interesting. But we can also
Hmm.
see, bad applications, and that's where things are not that beautiful. So I think a big concern for me right now is something that's already possible. It's like misinformation at scale. So AI can produce generative AI, especially can produce content which really looks like the truth, but it's not. So if it's in the wrong hands or used unethically, it can really produce, destructive results. I think in terms of an AGI risk, I think it's not the time to think about it, even if the growth is really exponential. I think we already have enough problems right now that justify, thinking about regulations, thinking about ethics, how to handle this properly, because it's such a powerful thing that we need to really just watch how we go. I'm not saying, of course, stopping everything or whatever. I'm saying like proceeding with caution, understanding at each step what the potential impacts might be, having also contributions from other fields, so not only engineers, but for example, psychologists, social scientists, politicians. I think honestly everyone should be involved on that debate, because it's not just a technical debate.
Right. Yeah, exactly. Exactly. And mostly because yeah, the applications are, and you're already working with psychologists, and you're like we mentioned in this episode, we're building bridges, and between data scientists and data engineer there are bridges, and there are vocabularies that are that make one understand less the other. So if at this level there are bridges that needs to be built for everyone to be aligned on what we're talking about, then we can only imagine at scale how we're going to build a lot of bridges, a lot of lines. And yeah, like you mentioned, the content creation at scale, fake news at scale, is very destructive. This is a very destructive power, but it have to be taken into account and have to be dealt with. This is why regulations, ethic is sincerely extremely important into this field. So this is AI. Do you have some? So two questions in one, very short ones. How do you see ML engineer and ML ops evolving? That's
Okay,
my first question.
I think as we see more and more of those foundation models,
Hmm.
I think ML and ML ops engineering will become more and more important, because it will become really less about the use case you have, but more on how to put that in your own context and in your own company. So, for example, you
Hmm.
mentioned Gamma. It's a model that's really efficient, but you need to learn how to deploy it in your context. You need to be aware of the cost of that, and there are many factors where ML ops and ML engineering will really come in handy for companies, I would say. So that's where I'm seeing, because mostly right now we are going to deal with APIs and things like that. So ML engineering will become really important to also optimize those models, because those models right now they consume a lot of energy. They're costly, so you need to work on that as well. And so yeah, I think the future is very promising for those who want to dive into this.
Awesome, awesome. I'm really looking forward to. Yeah, I'm not in a hurry, but I'm really looking forward to everything and how it's going to uh, to help us build, create a better world. I think that's my optimistic vision, and of course, we'll face some challenging times. Sorry, but I mean, well, how do you see open source? How do you see the role of open source in this big
Well,
picture?
I think the role of open source is pretty important, because up to now I think the software community has really relied on open source. For example, with GitHub, Linux, which is basically every system, and all the software. And I think the community really appreciates it. So I think the open source could be the future, in the sense that community, I think, to me, is usually the future. I mean, I tend to be very optimistic, but I usually think that building together is the future. and something that can be opened by
Mm.
others, that can be analyzed by others, that can be improved by others. That's how we grow, basically.
Awesome. Awesome. Well, I have two more little questions. We're at the end of the episode. But first, I want to thank you so
Mm.
much, Thales, for sharing on this show. I had an amazing time. I'm really looking forward to the content that you're publishing, and the work you're doing sounds very, very interesting, and really helping real world problems, which is great to be able to showcase also on the show, like how machine learning engineering can be such an important part of what we're building, and the better world we're building with this optimistic vision. My two last questions for you are, first of all, where can people reach out to you, see
Yeah,
more about you?
thank you for having me. It was an amazing session. I mean, it's really nice to talk about machine learning AI. I love it. And yes, so I have my LinkedIn page mostly. So it's basically Tales Marra. And I also write a little bit on Medium. I'll try to write more. It's in my goals. So if you also can check me out there. There are already some articles there about MLOps and CI/CD, which are basically some basics. So yeah, those are the two main networks.
Awesome. And would you have a message for the Let's Talk AI community? It can be advanced professional, more beginner level in the data field. And mainly the message can be anything we discussed in this episode. It can be personal, it can be
Okay.
professional. Feel free to whatever
I
comes
think
up
my
to your mind.
final message could be, let's keep doing things together. Let's keep talking. Let's keep discussing with one another, because that's the way we're going to grow, and that's the way we're going to ensure that the future is bright.
Awesome. Thanks a lot,
Thank
Thales,
you,
and I wish you to have
Thomas.
a wonderful day.